This election was no ordinary defeat for Labour. It marks a moment in history. The choice for Labour is to renew itself as a serious, non-conservative competitor for power in British politics, or retreat from such an ambition, in which case, over time, it will be replaced. But that is the starkness of the choice. This election can be analysed in conventional ways, and here it does not take political genius to work out what happened. I feel deeply for those good Labour MPs and candidates who lost through no fault of their own, and the thousands of party workers and volunteers who, as I know well, are the backbone of the party. And of course, Brexit was an issue. It was a Brexit general election, which was why it was a cardinal error for Labour ever to agree it. But an already difficult situation was made impossible by the failure to take a clear position and to stick to it. Now, I take very seriously the argument that we deserted or disrespected our working class voters by reopening the referendum result. But the problem with this position is that there was no way of uniting the country over Brexit. Britain is deeply divided over it. Now that Brexit will happen, we must make the best of it, and the country must come together. But until the decision was settled by the election, as unfortunately it has been, if Labour had gone for leave, it would simply have alienated the other half of the nation that opposed Brexit, as well as the vast bulk of party members. Post-election polling shows that between 2017 and 2019, we lost only a small number of voters who were leave, and all the way through, we had more than double the number of Remain voters. And actually, the biggest percentage fall in Labour voters between 2017 and 2019 was amongst young people, and they were probably dismayed by the ambiguity of the party over a Brexit they detested. What we should have done, following June 2016, is accepted the result, said it was for the government to negotiate an agreement, but reserved our right to critique the agreement, and should it fail to be a good deal for the country, advocate that the final decision should rest with the people. Ultimately, yes, we might have lost the most ardent Brexit support, but I believe with different leadership, we would have kept much of our vote in traditional Labour areas, whilst benefiting from the fact that even in those areas, the majority of those voting Labour were actually Remain. Instead, we pursued a path of almost comic indecision, alienated both sides of the debate, leaving our voters without guidance or leadership. The absence of leadership on what was obviously the biggest question facing the country then reinforced all the other doubts about Jeremy Corbyn. What is important is to understand why his leadership was so decisively rejected. This is not about Jeremy Corbyn as a person. I've no doubt he's someone of deeply held and sincere beliefs who stayed true to them under harsh attack. But politically, people saw him as fundamentally opposing what Britain and Western countries stand for. He personified politically an idea, a brand of quasi-revolutionary socialism, mixing far-left economic policy with deep hostility to Western foreign policy, which never has appealed to traditional Labour voters, never will appeal to them, and represented for them a combination of misguided ideology and terminal ineptitude that they found insulting. No sentient political party goes into an election with a leader who has a net approval rating of minus 40%. The takeover of the Labour Party by the far left turned it into a glorified protest movement with cult trimmings, utterly incapable of being a credible government. The result has brought shame on us. We let our country down. To go into an election at any time with such a divergence between party and people is unacceptable. To do it at a time of national crisis when a credible opposition is so essential to the national interest, is unforgivable. Anti-Semitism is a stain. The failure to deal with it, a matter of disgust that left some of us who voted Labour feeling for the first time in our lives conflicted about doing it. So at one level, sure, let's have a period of reflection. But any attempt to whitewash this defeat, present it as something other than it is, or the consequences of something other than the obvious, will cause irreparable damage to Labour's relationship with the electorate. And let us demolish the delusion that the manifesto was popular. The sentiment behind some of the policy reflected public anxieties. It's absolutely true. But in combination, it was over 100 pages of wish list. Any fool can promise everything for free. But the people weren't fooled. They know life isn't like that. And this loading in of free broadband run by government at the last moment was the final confirmation of incredibility. So, this is politics. I understand Messrs. Johnson and Cummings had a strategy for victory. We had one for defeat. And I noted the cockiness of the Johnson visit to Sedgefield to rub salt in the wound. But I would like to see their strategic brilliance measured against a team other than one whose striker was directionally oblivious, its midfield comatose, the defence absent in the stand chatting to a small portion of the fans, and its goalkeeper behind the net retweeting a clip of his one save in a 9-0 thrashing. For the Labour Party, the choices are starker than it realises. It's gearing up now to fight what it will call an ultra-Thatcherite Tory party. But you see, Boris Johnson also understood that the country can't be united over Brexit. So his strategy is to do Brexit and then treat it as an uncomfortable fact of life, but not one defining the Conservative Party. He will adopt centre-ground rhetoric on everything other than Brexit, and possibly even on that. Expect to see some former rebels back in the fold and in the Lords. And having turned Brexit from a Tory problem into the nation's problem, expect the tenor of the debate around Brexit to change. Now, his challenge will be formidable, not least on the new trade deal, the threat to the United Kingdom, quite apart from delivering on all those promises to northern former Labour voters. But most people would not bet against 10 years of Tory government right now. The first rule of politics, however, is that there are no rules of inevitability. Labour can keep with the programme and positions of Jeremy Corbyn with a new leader, in which case it's finished. Or it can understand that it must recapture the party from the far left, make radical changes, and begin the march back to power. But the biggest necessity is understanding the challenge didn't begin in 2015. It is rather the culmination of political and socio-economic changes over the last half-century and the circumstances of Labour's birth more than a century ago. This is a moment where either we use the lessons of defeat to build a progressive, modern political coalition capable of competing for, winning, and retaining power, or we accept that the Labour Party has exhausted its original mission and is unable to fulfill the purpose for which it was created. The history. As the 19th century Industrial Revolution gathered pace, the Whig Party became the Liberal Party and the effective alternative to the Conservative Party. The Liberal Party suffered the stresses of Home Rule for Ireland and the cleavage between the radical elements represented by Chamberlain and the more conservative remnants of Whiggery, and then later had to cope with Chamberlain's departure from the party and shift to a populism combining working class support and imperialist unionism. But despite all that, the Liberal Party was the main instrument of social reform and could still win the election of 1906 and govern up to and through 1914 and the outbreak of World War I. But a competitor appeared, the newly formed Labour Party, born out of the Labour Representation Committee, a trade union-based organisation designed to bring true representatives of the working class into Parliament and socialist. In time, the Labour Party took over as the main alternative to the Conservative Party, and the Liberal Party retreated to minority status. So, Lloyd George, a great Liberal reformer, Clement Attlee, a great Labour reformer, ended up in different parties. But this division in progressive politics had long-term deleterious consequences. In the last century, with the Labour Party and the Liberals separated, the Tories have been in power much, much longer than the opposition, including winning 8 out of the last 11 elections. Whereas in the years of Tory-Liberal Party competition, actually the Liberals won more elections than the Tories. In time, the Labour Party became reliant on traditional working class organisations and constantly was pulled towards a socialism which blunted at crucial moments its appeal to the aspirant working class. It had its liberal wing, represented by the likes of Roy Jenkins, but it was always viewed with some suspicion. The traditional left and right of the party, Bevin and Bevan, if you want, were themselves often uncomfortable bedfellows. But they united around Labour as a party of government, parliamentary, not revolutionary politics, pro-NATO and the transatlantic alliance, and within the mainstream of European socialist and social democratic politics. Then there was a third strand of leftist politics, which derived from Marxist-Leninism and was an early thorn in the side of the Labour leadership. From the beginning, the leadership shoved this strand to the fringe of Labour politics. Now, it mounted an assault on the party's commanding heights through Tony Benn in the 1970s and 1980s, but it was repulsed actually under Michael Foot, who supported Dennis Healey against Tony Benn and moved to expel the militant tendency from Labour. Throughout this time, however, something else was happening. The economy and society were changing. The middle class grew, and those instruments of collective power, like unions, lost their industrial base. And as the state also grew in size and authority, it became clear that though the state was of course a means of social progress, it could also be a vested interest, and the limitations of the state in an era of individual choice and increased income became more apparent. The trade union and industrial base became hollowed out. The Labour Party structures had shown themselves vulnerable to infiltration. The values of the Labour Party remained strong, but the offer to the people weak and outdated. New Labour was an attempt to reunite the Liberal and Labour traditions of progressive politics. Both traditional left and right of the Labour tradition were expressly included, symbolised by the leadership, myself, and the deputy leader then, John Prescott. But the far left was put back to the fringe. A study of Labour history had showed us that in the 20th century, Labour had governed only intermittently. The longest unbroken period of power, up to 1997, was 6 years. Never had the Labour Party won 2, let alone 3, 2 successive full terms. So the party programme was reshaped around an appeal to aspiration as well as social justice, to business as well as to unions. Culturally, it was strong on defence and law and order, but also socially liberal. We won 3 successive full terms and governed for more than twice the length of any previous Labour government. The party reached out beyond tribe, but didn't neglect its traditional voters. It placed itself firmly on the side of the victim, not the criminal, on the side of the working class, who believe you must earn what you get, on the side of the patient and pupil interest, not the producer interest. It championed investment in public services, but matched it to reform to ensure the money was spent wisely. It explicitly rejected the anti-Western worldview of the far left and was on the side of people who were patriotic about their country. It was not, for all the caricature since we left office, a project of the metropolitan liberal elite. It assembled a new coalition of traditional working class voters, aspirational voters who had previously turned to Margaret Thatcher, and it fused together the progressive voice that had been split in the previous century. The extraordinary thing is the Labour Party's desire today to rewrite its only period of majority government in half a century in negative terms. And that's why it's important to say the following. We did not neglect those traditional Labour heartlands and some appeasement of the middle class. We made the largest ever investment in schools and hospitals in those communities, redistributed wealth through tax changes and tax credits. Our pensioner and child poverty programs cut those radically. We took the homeless off the streets, and through Sure Start, the minimum wage, and a host of other programs, helped those who needed help most. And we kept their support. In 2005, in Sedgefield, my majority was almost 20,000. In Bolsover, it was 18,000. In Scotland, we had 41 of the 56 seats, including 2 with increased majorities over 2001. The support we lost was mainly amongst the middle class, especially over tuition fees and Iraq. The point of all this is not to go back to the policies of New Labour, but to understand New Labour's place in Labour's history so we better understand how to forge Labour's future. And to set New Labour within the history of progressive politics in Britain, where Labour sits but is not in sole occupation. This defeat is seminal. We cannot afford to repeat 1983, moving crab-like towards reality. You know the narrative, or those of you familiar with the Labour Party do. Among the far left, we won the argument. It's just for some inexplicable reason, the British people, having decided we were absolutely right, decided to vote for the other guys. Among others, it is many of the policies were really popular, but maybe too many of them. Our leadership was a problem, but it did inspire lots of people. It wasn't that we were too extreme, we just allowed the media to portray ourselves that way. We now have to stand with our communities and the assault which will be mounted upon them by the Tories, etc., plus a bit of we need to be with working class communities against the liberal London elite sort of populism. If we go down this line, I tell you, it'll be 15 years more of Tory government. The country won't tolerate this, and this is the challenge for Labour. There are people disenfranchised in our politics today, angry at the way the country has been let down by its non-conservative opposition, and feeling hopeless. And for the country, there's a generation of smart, capable, politically conscious people, especially young people, who will never be Tories, but have no place in Parliament because of the state of the Labour Party, and whose talent is therefore shut out of the contribution it could make to Britain. 2 things must happen. First, there should be a parallel debate in and out of the Labour Party about the future of progressive politics, how it's reconstructed and reshaped into a winning coalition. This should include Labour, traditional left and right, the Lib Dems, those disenchanted with both main parties, and those not at present engaged in any party. It has to be a big tent, open debate, and a frank one. Second, we need urgently a new policy agenda for progressive politics, one of the things our institute works on. At the heart of it will be understanding and mobilizing the technological revolution, the 21st century equivalent of the 19th century industrial revolution. This is central. It will mean a complete reordering of the way state and government is conceived and organized, huge focus on education and infrastructure, new ways of dealing with generational poverty, a recasting of corporate governance, a responsibility to ensure that we have a stimulus nationally and internationally of the science and technology necessary for environmental change, and very specific measures, particularly after 10 years of austerity, to connect communities and people left behind by the changes driven by globalization. But it's got to be policy for the future, radical but modern. The agenda of the far left is not progressive. It's a form of regression to an old status tax and spend program of the 60s and 70s. And it won't work. I understand why for some it has real attractions, because it speaks to the intense feelings of marginalization and desire for radical change, particularly after austerity. But it's essentially a cry of rage against the system. It's not a program for government. To win power, we need self-discipline, not self-indulgence, listening to what people are truly saying, not hearing only the parts we want to hear, understanding that you can't play with passion alone, but require strategy, preparation, professionalism, winning the intellectual as well as the political battle. In 1983, after my first election, having been out on the doorsteps of Sedgefield for several weeks listening to Labour voters, telling me that they were voting Labour despite the state of the party rather than because of it, I attended a meeting in my constituency organised actually by the far left, still strong after the Bennite surge, entitled something like Learning the Lessons of Defeat. And Dennis Skinner was the main speaker. And at the outset, the chairman urged us to be honest. And naively, because I only just started in politics, I took this instruction literally. So I did speak honestly. I said we were way out of date in our thinking, far too left, seemed like we were living in the era of black and white TV, in an age of colour, and so on. Well, I was heard in complete silence. And then Dennis got up afterwards and tore me limb from political limb. And I remember coming out of the meeting reeling and in shock. And my very wise agent said to me, "You were the only person in the room talking sense, but in the future, learn to say it better." By 1994, when standing for the leadership, I'd learned to say it better. I chose my ground carefully. I didn't unnecessarily offend. But no one doubted where I stood. The Labour Party is presently, today, marooned on Fantasy Island. And I understand would-be leaders will want to go there and speak the native language in the hope of persuading enough people eventually to migrate to the mainland of reality. But there is a risk that the only people speaking the language of reality to the Labour Party today are those who don't aspire to lead it. Unfortunately, 2019 is much worse than 1983. Then was our second defeat. Now was our fourth. The country is different. Politics is different. The country is less fixed in political affiliation, and politics moves at speed, accelerated by social media. We don't have the luxury of the slow march back. We can correct our historical and contemporary weaknesses or be consumed by them. But that choice is unmerciful. And that's why it's important to go back to what I said and misspoke at the beginning. The choice for Labour is to renew itself as the serious, progressive, non-conservative competitor for power in British politics, or retreat from such an ambition, in which case it will be replaced. That is how stark, harsh, difficult, but true the choice is. And the choice is now. Thank you.